First of all, welcome you, the grantees from CaixaResearch Health call, which is, as you know, our most important call. And we would like to thank you for your time in getting engaged in this session, which is crucial and key for the development of the project for us. But I would like to say hello again to the La Caixa Foundation staff, which is here as well, and especially to Dr. Ignasi Labastida from University of Barcelona, I will give the floor immediately to him and will be the leader of this training session. Before that, just I would like to tell you why this session is important to us. And we know that it might represent a little burden for you, but we believe it is important because we are always engaged in trying to think about how we can make our calls more impactful in the research ecosystem and in the social and clinical translation of the results of the research. So we do it for that. It's not just an idea out of the blue, but we are trying to make the most impact possible. We know that there is a trade-off with here with the burden that might suppose to you, and to fight against that, we thought that it would be a good idea to try to give you the best possible tools at our on that we could provide, and the best possible tools that we could think of is the team of Ignasi Labastida, which has an extensive experience in mentoring projects like yours to develop their output management plan. So we are trying with this session to facilitate your life, to make us a bit more easy to understand the impact and increase the impact of our projects. I stop here. Sorry for that, but on behalf of La Caixa Foundation, thank you very much, everybody, for being here. And Dr. Ignasi Labastida, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nacho, for this kind presentation, and welcome to everyone, and good morning for all of us. And I hope this session will be useful for you, and after this scheduled 2 hours, you will think that it was worth to stay here. And as Nacho just said, I think this has to be seen as not as a burden, but as something that is useful, not because you have now this grant from La Caixa, but also because it will be useful for your research, for your further projects, etc. So I'm Ignasi Labastida. I'm a physicist. I did my PhD at the University of Barcelona, and currently I'm the Rector's Delegate for Open Science at the University of Barcelona, but most of my time I work in the CRAI, which used to be the library of the university, supporting researchers in his daily or her daily basis, so helping on publications, on research data, on any kind of outputs. So I'm gonna share the presentation, but before I share the presentation, and of course the presentation will be available for you afterwards, just small housekeeping comments. Please put your mics muted. I think you already have all of them, but just in case. You can have your camera on or off. It's up to you. I appreciate to see some faces and not just a black screen. So thank you for the ones who have the camera and I can see your faces. I feel less lonely. And also the session is scheduled that I will explain. I will do first the framework of what is this idea of research data and how we manage research data. And afterwards, we will have more a practical session. I will comment on some of the data management plans or output management plans, as La Caixa says, to discuss some issues that I have already seen in your or your colleagues' output management plans. And I will be delighted to answer any question, any comment, and I will probably ask you things to understand what you put in your output management plans. I must say that I have seen the output management plans in the past, and now And I think we are increasing the quality of those plans. So probably we all are learning on doing things better. And I think at the end, we will learn to do things more useful for all of us. When someone wants to talk, I will call his or her name, and you will please switch on the camera if it's not yet switched on. You can make any question during my talk in the chat, and then at the end of the talk, I will come back and answer those questions. So I don't think there are more housekeeping things to tell you. If you have any comment, anything, just use the chat, please. Feel free to do it. And I might stop during the presentation and check the chat or say, well, is everything clear? Do you want any explanation, etc. So let's start. I'm gonna share the presentation, as I said. And the outline of this session will be first to explain the context. Why we are doing that? Because as Nacho already said, we don't want to put you another burden. Why La Caixa now is asking me for this output management plan? I think this has a broader context. There is a framework of open science, and I would like to mention, and especially today, that we are still celebrating during all this week the Open Access Week. So it's something that is completely linked to the research data and the management of quality research data. We'll talk a bit about research data, what we understand as research data. We'll focus mainly in data, but afterwards, if you want, we can discuss also other kind of outputs. I always say that it will be perfect to analyze not just publications. We need to have more data, we need to have more code, and we need to have any outcome from the research. We will review a bit requirements from funders, especially the La Caixa, but also I would like to mention some funder requirements that are similar to see that it's nothing strange, that is the La Caixa the only one who is asking for that. Also, institutions are making now requirements, and journals, and some of you already mentioned in some data management plans that there are requirements from journals to share more outputs. We'll talk about this buzzword FAIR, what FAIR means, especially because in the output management plan there are some questions about FAIR, so we need to understand what is FAIR, and I can just advance that FAIR is not open. FAIR is something else than open, and we can discuss that later on. We will go to the planification, so how we plan the management of your data. I will mention some ethical considerations. I will discuss how to work with data, give some tips, how to share the data, and finally, we'll have a look at the output management plan of La Caixa, and we will see some cases, and afterwards we'll review some of the input that you already, not you precisely, but you or your colleagues already have provided. Okay, so let's start with the context. The context we are putting in place this research data management is the open science. We are living now in a context where many funders, institutions, organizations are really pushing for a science more open. As open science, we can understand a science that is more transparent, collaborative, but the key question is to be more close to the society. This is a taxonomy made by a project called Foster, where you see here that open science could be everything. Because at the end, I always say, I hope that in the near future, we will have some session to discuss closed science. There will be no open science because science will be open by default. And we will have sessions about closed science, why we need to close something in science or in research. And I think it's also interesting because we have to learn and to decide when we need to open, when we need to close. So it will be interesting, and I hope in the near future we will have these training sessions about closed science. If we try to find a definition for open science, we can take this one from the Commission, saying that open science aims at transforming science through the ICT tools, networks, and media, and to make research more open, global, collaborative, creative, and closer to society. And also it includes here a lot of other things like efficiency, quality, integrity, reproducibility, equity, transparency, and public engagement. So all these topics need to be put into the idea of the open science. And research data management is included in all that, because we want more efficiency, more quality, more integrity, more reproducibility, equity, transparency, and public engagement. When we share some data with not just our colleagues, with the citizens in general, with the public, what we are aimed at is improve our impact, not just among the researchers, but also in the society. There are many calls for open science, for new policies, for engaging researchers and citizens with research. And one of these calls was made 5 years ago in Amsterdam, when the Dutch had the presidency of the Council of Europe. And there was this call for action. I always say we need more action and less talking. And in that time, there were two goals. I think two goals that still are among us. The first is the publications, but the second one is that we needed then, and we still need, a fundamentally new approach towards optimal reuse of research data. Data sharing and stewardship is the default approach for all publicly funded research. This requires definitions, standards, and infrastructures. And from this time, 5 years ago, I think we have been evolved. We have more definitions, we have more standards, and we have more infrastructures. But we still need a lot to do and a lot to work. Probably in the next year, 2022, when France will have the presidency of the Council, we'll see also a big push for open science, because we already know that in February, the French presidency is organizing a big event about open science. Which is the final goal? Well, the final goal is to have data more reusable. So data that must be findable, not just embedded in a paper, but we need the data living outside the papers. So having data in some repositories, in some portals where I can find the data and I have definitions of that data. We need the data to be accessible, but also, and I think this is probably the most challenging, interoperable. So meaning that data could be understood not just for humans, but also for machines. And that's, as I said, the most challenge. And finally, we need data to be reusable. And here sometimes this reusability is understood as open. It doesn't have to be this. Everything must not be open, because we know that some data must be closed. However, reusability means that you can inform people about how you can reuse the data, how you can contact us, and maybe have an agreement. We'll see it later on. If we have finally this fair data available in some portal, in some repository, whenever in a suitable venue, we can build this idea of the European Open Science Cloud. You know, if you're familiar with this project, the EOSC is a layer, I can say more than an infrastructure, a layer that is trying to connect all the existing and future infrastructures of data and other outputs, and to connect them to make your life easier. Meaning that maybe you have a kind of interface where you could say, I need data on this disease, on this topic, and you don't need to go to all the different repositories, all the different portals. There, they will point you where is that data that you might be interested for your research. At the same time, if you publish, you share your data appropriately, then this data will be easily found out with the European Open Science Cloud. Okay, what do we understand as research data? Well, it depends, of course, of your discipline, of your areas. It depends if a month ago I was giving a similar talk with people from social science. For them, data is different than the one you are used as data. But let's see that data can be seen as something that is moving. So there is a cycle of the data. We create data, we process the data, we analyze that data, we try to preserve the data, and probably also something that we have to learn is we can delete data if it's gonna not be used in the future, and we think that, well, maybe making simulations, we don't have to keep all the data. So we need also to learn how to preserve data. We can provide access, we can give access to the data openly or just restrictedly. And finally, once we provide this access, someone can reuse the data. And reusing the data, we can create data again, processing data. So it's all like a cycle. If we look in a similar way, the research cycle, we see that in every moment of this cycle, data is with us. So meaning that when we are discussing about research data management, it's important to know that it's not an issue when we have to deal with at the end of the project. It's an issue that it's in every moment of our research, and especially from the beginning, because when you apply for a grant, sometimes, and more frequently now, you are already asked, how are you gonna work with your data? First of all, of course, which will be your data, and how you plan to deal with your data in all this cycle. So it's at that moment when you are required to organize your data or to think how you're going to organize your data. And by doing that, you are required to make a data management plan or an output management plan. When you conduct your research, you have to think about how you're going to generate the data, where you're going to store the data, how you're going to process the data, and how you're going to analyze and interpret the data. Once you preserve your research, where the data will be placed, and especially if it's sensible data, it has to be crucial to decide that it's a safe place to put your data. You have to think about formats, mediums, especially if you want to preserve the data, because if you are not using a proper format, maybe in a few years, this data could be useless because it could not be used anymore. And finally, when you want to share your research, when you publish your findings together with publications and other kind of outputs, you can publish your data. You can get a DOI, an identifier, as you have in other outcomes. You can decide which is the license, which are the conditions, how the data is shared. And of course, if it's open, if it's restricted, and what is the information you provide to the users, in a broader sense of users, on how they can reuse the data. And again, we then can begin again all the cycle of the research. Which data? How we can understand data? I just took this definition from CaixaResearch, that it's a confederation trying to standardize the different terms of research. And data is what is used as primary source to support technical or scientific inquiry, research, scholarship, or artistic activity that are used as evidence in the research process and or are commonly accepted in the research community as necessary to validate research findings and results. It could be digital or non-digital, of course, it depends on how you work. And research data could be experimental data, could be observational data, operational data, third-party data, public sector data, monitoring data, we can classify data in different ways. We can classify data by its provenance. It can be, as I said here, experimental or observational or simulated, but also we can classify data for primary or secondary once it is processed, or also we can classify data by the format or the media. So some data could be text, some data could be images, some data could be some specific format that you use in your experiments or your devices, because sometimes the data comes from special devices with special characteristics. Okay, so we know what is data, we know which are the different ways of working with the data, but what I'm required to do? I put here the requirements from Horizon 2020 that it will be kept for Horizon Europe more or less the same. Funders are not requiring to open all data. Sometimes we have this feeling, oh, my funder is saying everything has to be open. My funder is saying all data must be open. But of course, many of you could say, I cannot, it's not possible. For legal issues, for something could be confidential, could be privacy issues there, many questions. So mainly what the funders are asking to do is to open data as much as possible, but to close data as necessary as needed. What are the funders asking is do a good data management plan with information on how the data will be generated, how to ensure the curation, preservation, and sustainability of the data, and which parts of the data finally will be open. And for that, you also have this idea of fair. So the idea is have your data as fair as possible, and then we'll see if it will be possible to be as open as possible. And there are no any specification where it has to be open, in which place. It's always left to the researchers to find the best place. Even for institutions, probably many of you are in institutions where they have repositories, and it's not that you have to place your data in your institutional repository, because many of you are already sharing data in specific venues of your disciplines. So if you have a consolidated repository there, there is no need to find to another venue. This is what La Caixa is asking you. And of course, this was the policy that was put in force in the 1st of June 2019. So we have this policy for 2 years, and we're seeing that researchers are now reacting and taking this policy into account. So as a synthesis, what the main funders are requiring from you, and La Caixa is one of them, is a data management plan, to have your data as fair as possible, to publish your data related to the published outputs. So when you publish your outputs, when you share your outputs, at the same time, share the data that underpins that outputs, that publications. You are not required to publish all your data, all your primary data, no. And as I said, data as open as possible, as close as necessary. Of course, there are other policies or other requirements. I would like here to highlight some policies from journals, because you have seen that and probably you have already been asked to share that data. I put here, for instance, what PLOS has the statement on data availability. And of course, it says, when specific legal or ethical restrictions prohibit public sharing of data, authors must indicate how others may obtain access to data. And this is the idea of reusability with the FAIR philosophy. There is another one here from Ecology and Evolution, a journal that is required as a condition for publication. And this is, we've seen this more and more often, that some publications ask for that. If not, maybe you cannot just even start from the peer review process. And they suggest here some repositories or archives like GenBank, Treebase, Dryad, or the Knowledge Network for Biocomplexity. But as I said, they always keep the door open and say any other suitable long-term and stable public repository. So maybe if you don't have a stable or a consolidated repository, you can use your own center repository or a repository where your center collaborates. And another one a third availability possibility is from another journal that does not require. It only encourage to share the data. I want to remark that because I've seen in some of the output management plans that people is saying, well, I will share data within the publication, like I will share the tables or the graphs in the publication. And this is not the idea. The idea is that the data must be separated from the publications. Data that you have used to make a graph or to make some conclusions must be placed individually in a repository, a specific repository for data, not for publications. And that's the idea of sharing data and to find data by itself. Okay, let's review this idea of FAIR, because we've been talking about FAIR. We can read it in many places that data must be fair, etc. But what is the meaning? FAIR is this acronym that is data must be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this idea could be also applied to any outcome of your research. So we are now talking about publications. Publications must be findable, accessible. Well, probably it's hardly interoperable, but they should be interoperable and reusable at the end. But we can also think about code or other output could be following the same idea to make it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. These are the FAIR principles that were published a few years ago by some researchers. They published an article saying data should follow these principles, that the compliance of the principles are on the right-hand side, like resources are uploaded in a public repository. We need metadata. It's not, we cannot understand we cannot think that what the funders or the journals are asking us is just to upload, for instance, a spreadsheet that nobody can understand. We need to make this effort that our colleagues, but also other people, need to understand the data we share. And for that, we need metadata, and that's very important. And sometimes when we close and we need to close the data, we can share the metadata and let the people know that we have some data that could be useful for them. Here also there are explanations about which are the accessibility of these resources, in this case data, but as I said, any output, to try to have at least the metadata as interoperable as possible. And for that, it would be interesting to follow some metadata standards. And then once the data is in a repository, we will be probably harvested by top layer repositories, for instance, this European Open Science Cloud. And also information about how I can reuse your data and if there are some restrictions or there are some specific conditions. So we need to work with metadata. We need to work with identifiers. We need to think about the names. Sometimes it's useful to have meaningful names. We need to think about version control to inform people this is version 1, this is version 3, this is version 4, specifically if you are using the same name for the dataset and you are improving the contents of the dataset because maybe you are adding more information there. The information about accessibility is to know if it will be open by default, where it will be deposited, if there is a need for software, because sometimes our data is specific, has a specific format that is right. I mean, there is no problem if there is a specific format that is a kind of standard for all our disciplines and is the common format that we all use. But if we need a specific software to deal with this data, we need to inform everyone about this software, and maybe you can also provide the code together with the data. As I said, the interoperability probably is the most challenged thing because we need to share data among people, but also among machines. So as many standards, as many ontologies we can use, the best for this interoperability. And you can place embargo periods, you can place conditions to comply with the reusability, but inform the people, tell the people in a year, this data that you only see now, the metadata, will be available for everyone, or you can only use this data in this or the other condition. This is an image of different levels of fairness of data on the bottom, where the important thing is to have this identifier, to have the information about how to describe that describes the data. And then on the bottom of these three images, you'll see that some data is closed, some data is open. And finally, I mean, the utopian fair data on the bottom right is where you have everything with the functionality links and you can make queries and everything, and it will come back and give you some answers of your queries. On the top, you'll see some of the data that we have now that is totally unfair. We don't have information about identifiers. We don't know where's the data. Maybe it's in a supplementary material somewhere, or maybe it's placed in a web page that hardly can be found. There is no metadata, so I have no information. Sometimes you can use some multidisciplinary repositories, for instance, Figshare or Dryad or Mendeley Data or other ones, where yes, they can provide you with a DOI, so with an identifier, but if you don't add more information, if you don't add information about the metadata or the provenance, there's not useful information. And finally, you can have also some fair metadata. I would like to show you an example. I don't want to really scare you about this, because sometimes when I share this example, people say, well, it will be impossible to have a full fair data. I try to advise researchers on at least try to share and start sharing some data with as much information as possible related with the data. I really don't expect now to have full linked open data. And as you'll see, it's very difficult to have a fully linked open data. We'll need probably some automatic process to process the data, to have it correctly, I mean, fully understood by machines. But if you provide some information, probably you will be already fulfilling this goal of sharing your data and to be reusable for others. This is a proposal made by Tim Berners-Lee many years ago, when we were discussing not about fair, we were discussing about open data. And what he was saying at that moment was that, yes, data, we define open data as this data that is published or shared with a license that tells you you can reuse the data a priori. You don't need to ask for permission, because I grant the permission at the beginning, and then data can be reused. Probably if we fulfill and we comply with the full definition of openness without restrictions, besides, for instance, the mention and the knowledge of authorship. However, what Tim Berners-Lee was saying there is we have to be aware that sometimes what we call open data is open for the license, but it's not in the most suitable format. I remember many years ago in Barcelona when the city council started the open data portal, giving information, giving data from the city council. They were using what is here tagged as 1-star open data, so PDFs. And in some of the output management plans, I see that still you mention that I will share data in PDF. So probably PDF are not the most suitable formats to share the data. PDF, it's good for documents, it's good for reading, but it's not good sometimes for sharing data. And that's why here it was tagged as 1 star. Then we can work with some spreadsheet files, for instance, Excel, but maybe if you want to be more standard and to be more open in this idea of the formats, maybe you can use other formats like the comma separated values. An example, if I share with you this data, well, you can tell me, I understand the data because I know what is Galway, I know that it's a place in Ireland, I know the days of the week, so I understand that it was in 2010, I understand there is Saturday, Sunday, Monday. I see on the right-hand side the figures that, well, I understand that are temperatures, degrees. I see that it's a Celsius scale. Well, that's understandable. I can share with you this table in a PDF, but machines cannot understand anything of that because they don't know what is Galway, they don't know what is Highland, they don't know what is this sea with this round there. So this could be seen if it was shared in a PDF as 1 star. What is 5 stars? And please don't get scared. This is 5 stars with all the information embedded there. Here are definitions of what it means Galway, what it means Ireland, what it means the different dates. Of course, to reach this level of openness, in this case open data, but also could be seen as fairness, I think we cannot now achieve it because we will need, I think, probably more time to make this data than to make the actual research. One day, probably, we can have some automatization on, maybe I have some data, I can have some programs, some applications that will provide this semantic information in the data. But we can find a balance among this and the previous image. And that's, I think, what we are aiming at having this balance and to inform a bit more about what we have in our data. Okay, so let's start with the planification, because we have already the context, we know what is fair data, we know what we are expected to do. So let's think about the planification. And the planification starts by thinking on how to fill this outcome or output management plan or data management plan. A data management plan has to be seen as a dynamic document. It's not a document that I do at the beginning of my project or my research, and it stays there forever. It's something that you plan, and probably you are planning how your research is going to evolve in the next years or the next year or the next period of time. But many things happen, and we've seen a lot of things happening in the last years that changes our research, changes our plans. So anything in this that from these changes that affects our data management needs to be also reported in new versions of the data management plan. You have to say, well, I was planning to maybe have these experiments, and for this reason or other reason, I have not done these experiments. I'm going to make a new experiment. I'm going to reuse data that already exists, etc. This could be reported in a data management plan, because a data management plan needs to be a useful document, something that is useful for you, where you have some doubts when you think, well, I'm not sure where we were doing, what we were planning. We wanted to share this data, but now we have signed a confidential clause, so we cannot. So let's change that. Or maybe you have new people in your team, and you can say, look, this is the way we are going to share or to work or to manage our data. So a data management plan has not to be seen as another bureaucratic burden. It's not something, well, I just send the data management plan and it's over. No, and that's the reason why Lagasha is now also reviewing the data management plans. It's something that when the Commission started asking data management plans, I always ask the Commission, who is giving feedback? Who is saying this is good, this is not good, this is probably, this needs a bit more of information? And they realize years after that it's very interesting to have this feedback to the researchers, because researchers also are willing to to have more information. Are we doing things well? How we can improve our information? And as I said, I've seen a change. I think we all learn on how to make those documents, and I hope that this learning is aimed at improve our research quality. So a data management plan must be seen as a document aimed at facilitating research, foreseeing possible problems, analyzing future situations. In many cases, I've seen researchers coming to me and saying, we have some data, but we are not sure that data, who is the owner of the data, who can grant permission to reuse the data, because we haven't planned. And when this happens in large consortia or with collaboration with different groups, it's difficult to decide at the end of the project. So in the data management plan, you can already make these reflections to think about, well, how are we going to decide in the future who will be the person or the group saying this data can be reused in these conditions or the other conditions. So in a data management plan, we need to see which data will be produced or gave there or observed or reused, which format, and how existing data will be reused. We'll have a look on that, because sometimes we say, well, I've seen data in internet, it's public, but we reuse it? So meaning that we can take the data and do things with that data and maybe publish a processed version of that data. We also have to put in the data management plan how data will be processed, stored, and preserved. And specifically, if you are working with sensible data, the storage is crucial. When data will be accessible and who could access the data. For instance, we can say, well, I work with my colleagues, with my lab, and the data is available only to this group of people. Once we process that data, we'll share the data with the other team in another lab, in another institution. And after, when we publish the first outputs, we will publish also the data and we will grant access to everyone. Also, it's important to identify who is responsible for the data, and if there is any rights, who is the rights holder of the data. Any ethical questions must be also put it in place in a data management plan. So I know that there are other processes. You have bioethical committees or other ethical committees that you are obliged to go and to have a validation. But you can already mention here, we will pass that because we have these ethical comments, and we will pass that to this ethical committee. And finally, how the data will be reusable, if possible, even with restrictions, but you can plan already that from the beginning of your project. So you need to answer questions like these ones. I always say that to fill a data management plan is not just filling. I need to an answer for section 2, for section 3, for section 2.1, etc. It's more like make a general reflection, and afterwards you will place the different answers in the different sections of the data management plan or the output management plan. So first of all, you can ask questions like, do you use personal or sensible data? Because then you have some conditions. Is your storing facility safe? So is fulfilling all the requirements, for instance, of the general regulation on personal data? Are you using standard formats? Can you use more another format that maybe will be better to preserve and better to share? Will your data be understood, not only for you, but for anyone? Are you authorized to reuse existing data? Are you sharing your data with your colleagues? And finally, are you publishing your data? When, where, and how? This is a data management plan template. We'll have a look afterwards at the one from La Caixa, but I want to share with you also other templates to see that they are not so different from the ones that La Caixa asked for it. So this is the one from the Commission, from the Horizon 2020, where there is a first question about the data summary. Explain me which is the data you're going to work with. An explanation on how you can make your data fair. And that's important. Fair at the end when you are going to share the data, because all this idea of making data findable, of the openness, the accessibility, the interoperability, the reusability, all that it's related to when you share the data. Probably your primary data does not need to be fair, because your primary data, maybe it will be kept in your computers, facilities, cloud, whatever. But what you want to share, what you want to make fair, is your secondary, your processed data. You can also establish here some allocation of resources. So maybe you need some money to deal with this data. All the aspects of data security, ethical aspects, and of course there is always a box where you can mention any other issue. There are tools to work with data management plans. You already have you've been provided by La Caixa with a tool where you can fill your data management plans, but maybe you are familiar with one of those tools. These are tools that are online, and you can put and fill your data management plan and share it with your colleagues. And once you have this already filled, then you can provide the data management plan through the Caixa platform, also from other funders' platforms. We have an application from Meta, originally the Digital Curation Center in Edinburgh. There is this data management plan online, and in CESUC, that is a consortium of universities of Catalonia, we made an adaptation of this. It's not in Catalan, it's in English, because the only templates that are there are the ones from the Commission, so we decided that it need to be in English. But probably we'll see if for instance, the Ministry of Science were saying that in the last call for projects, that will need to fill also a data management plan. So if there is any template, it will be placed there. There are other templates like this one or other tools like this one from OpenAir, Argos, that they say that it's going to be a data management plan, machine readable. So meaning that it will be placed everything in places where machines will read also data management plans. And another tool is this data steward wizard that brings you all the different process of filling a data management plan. So if you are interested, you can just go and have a look at all different tools. I now want to mention some of the ethical considerations, especially related with personal data, because we talk about FAIR, we talk about how to share data, and here I want to remark that first goes the ethical questions, not at the end. So this is an infogram made by the GDPR coalition, where you see that the issue of FAIR is the last, it's in the 6th position. So before doing your research, if you have, for instance, in this case, personal data, but also if there are ethical questions, first you have to think about how you are going to design your research. You have to take into account all the privacy issues. Maybe you need even to make a data protection impact assessment. And I've seen that some, at least in one project, I've seen that they perform one of these data protection impact assessment. So if you are really with your research impacting the personal data, the privacy of the patients or the users that you are working with, then you are required to make this assessment. You have to work also with this to inform the participants of your research. If you are working with humans, and you make this consented informed, and to make, there are standard ones, but you can use your own. And these documents are the ones that at the end will be validated for ethical committees. You have to, and this is the part of the storage, you have to be aware of the control of accessing the data. And I'm not talking about the published data, I'm talking when you are working with the data. It has to be in a safe place. And at the end, once we have all this, we will discuss if we can share some data and how we can share some data and how fair part of this data that we've been working with could be shared. This is an image, and we have another image here, a document from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, that again, at the end is when we discuss about how we share data, but before we have to take into account a lot of issues related with privacy and personal data. So how we can share this data? Well, we can have these common anonymizations, but we have to be aware that sometimes it's easy to de-anonymize. So not all the process of anonymization work for everyone. It depends of the samples, or depends of the information. If you have a small sample, let's say, for instance, if you're doing some research with old people and you only have a few of these old people, so having information like beyond 80 years, maybe it's easy to identify that person. So be careful with anonymization, because sometimes it does not work. You can also, in some information, delete things, change names, etc. That's another way of anonymizing. And also you can work with these processes of differential privacy. So if you need to share some database with sensible data, you can add other information. And the idea is that if you add individual information and you perform the same query and you get similar answers, then it's good. You have a good differential privacy. You have no you are not disclosing the information of an individual person. All these are different methods that probably most of you are already familiar with, but that's ideas on how to share some data when we cannot share the original data because we have privacy issues or ethical issues in that. Okay, some tips about working with data. For instance, if we reuse data, if we obtain data from externally, we have to make those questions. Are we allowed to use, are we allowed to publish the data, or a modification of the original data with our own data? I put here a couple of examples. One that tells you, okay, you can access the data, you will work with the data, but be careful, because once you work with the data, you at the end have to delete any copy you make from our original data. So these are portals with public information, with public data, but at the end, we can say that it's not really open data because there are a lot of restrictions, and even in this case, deleting the original data that will not allow you to reuse further this data. On the other hand, we have this kind of data. This is a Harvard Dataverse is a repository of data. And here you see that there is a CC0 that is a kind of public domain dedication, saying that this data, when you have this kind of licenses, this data can be reused without restriction. Moreover, with the CC0, you are not obliged to mention or to acknowledge all the authors. You can just say this, mentioning the source, or it's more like you apply your community norms more than a legal requirement done by the copyright or similar laws. When I mentioned the formats, you must think about, well, let's choose no proprietary formats if it's possible, because sometimes we are stuck to some formats from the machines, the devices, or the software we use. But if you have the choice, probably it would be a good choice to go to no proprietary formats. Also, another advice is to organize your folders, especially if you work with more people and if you work in facilities where you share folders, you share your information. If the organization is well, then it would be easier to understand what is inside those folders. And the same works with the names. If you put meaningful names on your files, it will be useful for all your colleagues to understand what is there in this file, in this data. I've seen already in some output management plans that you already mentioned that you will use some identifiers for your files that will be meaningful for all, etc. And as I mentioned before, it's important to use this control version. Here there are a list of recommended or preferred formats when you try to choose the formats for any different types of documents. Sometimes this is more related on the place you want to preserve your data in the future, because these preservation venues will require some specific formats that they are able to preserve. If you send other kind of formats, they will not commit to preserve that data for the period of time they committed to preserve. So for instance, if they say, I'm going to preserve for 10 years, for 20 years your data, they will tell you if it is in those formats, because if not, they may say, we are not going to preserve that data because we have not the tools to preserve that data. So I put here a link to one of these places, the DANS. This is the National Archive of Data for the Netherlands, and they suggest, they prefer these formats instead of the ones on the right-hand side. This is another example also of organizing data. This was published in training materials also from DANT, from the Dutch Federation of Research Data. And this is an example of a PhD student where she had all the information in different folders with meaningful names, etc. And also, it's important to document data. If you work, this is a program where you can make some statistical data. There is already information, there is already a place where you can define your variables, you can define the different values, etc. And if you have that in your software, you can reuse this information afterwards when you can share your data. Here, you already have all the information, all the metadata that could be useful at the end when you are publishing your data. When you are discussing about storing and saving your data, you have a lot of choices. Of course, you have your personal computers or laptops, external devices, USB drivers, servers, internal repositories, external or internal clouds, etc. But you have to think about which is the best place, and in different moments, which is the best place to put your data. For instance, if I go to the lab, maybe I need to carry my laptop and maybe I make a copy of the data there. But then once I have that, maybe I should, and probably you need to do that, to connect to an internal cloud and to place the data there, because it will be safer, but also it will have all these different backups strategies to keep your data. I've seen many times in the underground some notice asking people saying, I lost my laptop, I had all my PhD in my laptop, please help me to recover that. So it's good to have a strategy of backups, of safe copies, and especially if you work also with sensible data, that's important to decide which is the best solution for your research case. Here's an example of different places where you need to think where you have to place your data. This is the different facilities that the Dutch researchers had a few years ago. And recreating this cycle of the data, you see that you have different places where you have to decide where I'm going to place the data, where I'm working, where I'm going to preserve it, when I'm going to publish the data. We have to think which is the best and the most suitable place to do that. And at the end, when I want to share the data, you have also a lot of choices. You can have, as I said, your own subject-based repositories. And if you are not sure, you can have a look at this re3data.org portal, where you can look for your disciplinary repositories. You can use institutional repositories or consortium repositories, or national repositories. If we had a national repository of data like the Dutch have, then you can go there. And of course, you have all these multidisciplinary repositories. I always say more commercial, like Zenodo, Fixture, or Mendeley. Zenodo is not completely a commercial. It's something hosted at the CERN, but those have sometimes some requirements, some restrictions. And here it's a list of the different features of the different solutions of these multidisciplinary repositories. I'm sorry because this link is not yet working, because it's a link from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. As you may know, the Autonomous University had a hacker attack, and they have still many of their facilities unavailable. So if you try to link here, you'll see that you will have no answer. So hopefully in the near weeks, we'll have this again live, and you can you can look at these different features from the different repositories. Also, in the Catalan centers, I need to, in fact, update the image, because there is a new image since yesterday or 2 days ago. But this is a repository that you can use if you belong to one of the universities of Catalonia, but also one of the research centers, because it's a facility that we are working together, universities and research centers. So it's a repository specifically made for data, in a similar of a database that it's in the Netherlands or it's in Norway. And also you have to think about the different license and to decide which are the conditions I want to grant from the beginning, without people asking me for when I want to share the data. Sometimes you cannot really put conditions in the data itself, because the data is not, in many cases, not copyrightable. However, when you build data sets, when you build databases, then there are rights arising from this construction of the data sets and the databases. So then what you are putting conditions in on how people can extract the data from these data sets or from these databases, and you can limit the reusage of these the contents of the database. Also, you can share closed data. This is an interesting project from Harvard that it was called Data Tags. So identifying the security and the credentials you need to access to some data. This is the idea I mentioned before of sharing data, but sharing only the metadata and telling the people, this data cannot be publicly shared. However, you can contact us, you can sign here what is called the DUA, the Data User Agreement, something that is like this. And you can provide information about, you need to sign a data user agreement, and then you fulfill this idea of reusability of FAIR, because people say, okay, I'm really interested with this data. I read the metadata, I read the information you provide about this data that needs to be closed, but I want to contact you. I want to know how I'm going to reuse, or I can reuse this data. Just to end, I wanted to share with you this page that I think it's interesting. It's best practices on data management from the University of Yale, and is specific for health science. So if any of you want to get deeper information on all that, you can go to this page and have information. Well, I think I talk a lot. I have some examples here, but before going to the examples, I will stop sharing the screen, and I will ask you if you have any question, if you want to mention anything before going to the examples and going to the examples of the output management plan. I will stop it now and have a look at the chat. There are some questions from Joanna Costa. I don't know if Joanna, if you want to open the mic. Oh, please, Joanna.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Ignacio. It has been really enlightening, your presentation. These are very basic and maybe not a bit out of focus questions, but in practical terms, I was thinking about two things. One is, So the name that you attribute to the data, like a file or a database or, well, any type of data, it's on the researcher. So you don't have like a specific format that would tell you, for example, what kind of data it would be, or a more indications for the researchers of how to best decide for the names that they give to the files.
It's up to you. I mean, usually the repositories or the places where you publish or share your data don't make conditions on that. The only conditions, as I said before, are more the formats.
Okay.
So it's more a question for you to use meaningful names. So maybe it's good to have some reference to a project, some reference to a date, some reference to the sample you work with, or the experiment you are performing, the project. This is something that you, with your team, with your lab, have to decide. We're going to use this standardization of names. And then you can, even when you publish the data, say, usually you are asked to publish your data with a README file, with a readme.txt, for instance, and then you can say, you have all these data sets, and our nomenclature, our way of defining the names is the following. The first characters mean the name of the project, the researcher, whatever. And then if you explain that, people who access to your data will have already that information.
Okay, thanks. Just another question then afterwards. It's more of a concern, which is, maybe it doesn't happen, but when you publish your data in a publication, in a journal, you have a peer review. And the peer review, okay, it goes for the quality of the research, but it also assesses the quality of the technical performance. So how you did the experiments, if you took into considerations all the variables. So when another researcher or another person looks at your results, when it's in a publication in a journal, it is more or less confident that the results that are presented have been, validated in a way, assessed for validation. If you share results that are not in a repository, for example, where that has not been published in this format, so it has not been assessed by your peers, isn't there a danger that you will end up having sharing data that has not been validated in its quality? I mean, you say that I did this experiment and I got these results, but your peers have not validated that experiment has been well performed, and actually the results are good in terms of quality to be used by others. There's no such validation step, right?
I must say that sometimes when you publish your data together with the publication, sometimes the data itself is not really validated. It's more...
Okay, fair enough. But there is that step, I mean.
Yes. I think also we have to begin to learn how to validate the data. And probably that's a good question. Maybe we need to find ways of saying this data has been reviewed, or this data has been validated, and put some tags or something like that. So that's something still new, let's say this way, and probably we will need to find the ways to perform that. People sometimes say, I'm not going to review a paper without accessing the data, because I don't want to see just the graph or just the table. I want to see the data, and maybe I want to perform on to check. I remember many years ago, someone in a different discipline, not in health, was saying, I had these results, and they published a report. It was not a peer review, it was more like a report, and make some affirmations. And I had a lot of doubts, a lot of concerns. I'm not sure. I wasn't sure, because I was working in the same field, and I asked them, can I see the data? And once they provide me with the data and the information how they were processing the data, I told them there is a mistake here, here, and here. So I think data can also be useful for that, for the review of the outcomes in general. I mean, I think we have to think of a research output of something that is more complex than just the paper. So if I have the paper, the data, the methodology, and the software, and whatever it's seen as an output, then what you are reviewing is at the end the research. And you can see there is a problem in the data, or there is a problem in this conclusion, or there is a problem in the software. So if we end on this idea of having all these things together, maybe it will be easier to review everything.
But the user of that data should have that into consideration, because he has not gone in any threshold of quality, let's say, or assessment. Okay, thank you, Ignacio.
Thank you. I think the next question is from Aitana Ultra. Hello, Aitana. You can put your camera on.
I don't know if it's working, so hello. Anyway.
We see that black.
Yeah.
But please go ahead.
Yes, I don't know if it's a question, a comment, something to discuss, but so we work very much in open science, citizen science, and we work with many stakeholders. So when we share data, I'm aware of the formats that are considered open, but my experience is that if I share it using, I don't remember the names, DT, whatever, a public stakeholder will never use it. Citizen science will never get it. And probably many researchers will have no clue about how to deal with this kind of format data. So we make this very open for machines, maybe, probably, but then we're closing this for humans. So I think there is a tension here, and I just wanted to comment this and maybe get some of your inputs. Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. Always very clear and very smart.
Thank you, Aitana, and it's nice to see you, or at least hear you again. And yes, you make a really good comment, because sometimes is, as you mentioned, there are formats that are not reusable at all for citizens in general. So a good approach also is to share data in multiple formats. So the same data, you can just release a data set saying, I'm gonna release this that data set with this format because it's the useful for machines or for the software we use. And I make another format, let's say in a spreadsheet, in an Excel or a similar format that will be easier for citizens or the public in general to reuse. So that could be a good strategy if you want to find this balance between the machines and the persons.
But even for researchers, right?
For researchers, yes.
I don't know what's your experience, but I would guess that a very small percentage of researchers might be able to use these super open formats. Or to understand them.
So that you have to find the balance. It's not that you have to push for open, because if it's not a format that could be used for everyone. But the idea especially is when you want to preserve the data. So you may face that when you are thinking, not just sharing, but preserving the data in some facilities, they will ask you for these formats because they cannot commit to preserve your data for a long period of time if they don't have the tools, and many cases are not proprietary tools, to perform different copies and to maintain that preserved as it is without losing information. So it's not, it's sometimes a question, it's a question of the facility and not a question of the usability among researchers or the public.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome, Idana. Now we have another question from Ana Rodriguez. Please, if you can switch on the camera.
Good morning. Yes, my camera is on.
Okay, I cannot see it anyway, but no, but doesn't matter. Please,
sorry,
go ahead.
Okay. I'm sorry for that, but supposedly it's on. So I also have one question. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation, and it was really, I learned some things. And one of my main issues is, since there are several repositories available, and this changes a little bit from area to area, the ones that people use the most, My main concern is how should we select the repository, meaning that, of course, all of them have advantages and disadvantages. But what, in your opinion, do you think it's the most important criteria when we are choosing the repository to put data?
Okay, another good question. I think, Anna, that the first choice is your disciplinary repository. So if you usually go to a place, I don't know, people go to GenBank or go to GBIF or go to other repositories to find data, and you know that the data is there, so probably is the first choice. Go where you are already going to find your data or your colleagues' data, because then you will improve the number of data in that repository. And if it's a common place where you share data among your colleagues, then it would be the first choice. If you don't have that, then probably you need to find out which is the most suitable data repository according to some criteria. For instance, that they say that your data placed there will be fair. So meaning that they will have DOIs, they will have these identifiers, they will preserve the data for a period of time, they will facilitate metadata in a standard way that other harvesters could find your data. So meaning that if we have this Open Science Cloud or we have other layers of finding data, your data will be found. And also you need sometimes to decide on technical requirements, because there are solutions that make restrictions. So if you have huge files, maybe there are some places where you will not be able to publish that, or you will be asked for some money. And maybe then if you haven't budgeted that money, you don't have the possibility to publish in that repository. So you have different criteria on when you have to decide in which is the best solution for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Anna. So I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I don't see, let me check, I don't see any hand raised. So I will come back to the presentation and I will share with you some examples and some comments of the actual output management plans that I have already checked and reviewed. So let's share again the presentation. And here I like also always to look for a true story, for true cases, sharing with you. And I found out this, some information of a case that happened in 2014, where some researchers in the US found in a freezer of a lab a box with some material that they figured out that was in some samples that was back for many years, in this case some vials that were dated in 1950. And the idea of this case is that how you can not just think about data in digital, but also in all kind of data, how you can identify, document your data. And you don't need to read now this because you have the slides afterwards. But the idea here is a good advice on which is the documentation you need to put in your data. Here you say that at project level, you need to think and to identify, and going back to some of the questions we had before, title, creator, unique number used to identify the data, the dates, the methods, the processing, the source, if there is any funder. You have the link on the top, so you can have a look of all this explanation. You can, at the file level, the subject, the place, the language, the variable list, the code list, because if you are using different codes, so who will understand those codes, technical descriptions, accessibility rights. So these are a good, like I could say, like a kind of checklist that you can use in your research if you want to have your data documented. I mean, it's originally based in something that was more physical than digital, but it's an example on if you identify, if you tag your data in a proper way, then it will be easier to not lose this data in a folder, and one day you will open a laptop and say, what is the data? What is the meaning of this data? Here also, I wanted to share with you a real data management plan. This is a management plan from the Commission, from a European project. And in this, there are many data management plans. If you just Google data management plan examples, or I cannot also provide, the Autonomous University also had in their repository a list that we work together with other universities of data management plans, and they were a good reference, a good example. As I said before, nobody says if it's good or not. It's more like it was left on our criteria. We thought that there were good examples because they were explaining quite well what they were doing. So what it's really interesting in this data management plan is that they did something that it could be useful for you when you are thinking about how you're going to manage your data. Here they make different tables, and I'm sharing with you some of the tables. It's a document that has several pages, but I want to show this as an example. Here they say, okay, we're working on these 8 kind of data: stakeholder contacts, public security collection, quantitative survey data, expert interview data, etc. And then they put the origin. It's publicly data that is already available, or it's primary data that we will build. And then, because it's a project, they put the reference to the work package, and they already put the different formats. So this, we're going to use this data, we're going to use, we're going to use this format, we're going to use the other formats. So in the table, you already know which kind of formats, which kind of data, which is the origin of the data, and it's a good summary to start with. Afterwards, they decide again with the 8 types, and here for in the sake of a space, I only put the first 6. Here you see, again, regarding the data type, if the data is going to be openly available. There are data that will not be available. So for instance, if you have a list of contacts, like in this case, you don't want to publish those contacts. You don't need to publish the telephones or the addresses of these people. But then you have different yes, like 2, 3, and 4. That is the surveys that we're performing here. And there is no justification on why they have to close. And this is good because you are not justifying why you need to open, because open is the default. So what you are justifying is why I need to close. I don't want to share this data because this. And this could be seen as I cannot open the data because of the legal or privacy issues, but also because I want to close it for exploitation until I publish the papers, etc. But it's important, this idea of justifying close and not justifying open. And once there is a justification on why this data is closed or cannot be openly available, there is also an option on, well, it might be an alternative solution. I'm not saying that always there is an alternative solution, but I think it's relevant in this data management plan that they are also thinking about possible solutions. And finally, and you see that here they start with 2. It's not that I lost the number 1. It's because number 1, it's not open, because it was said in the previous table. This is they start with the second type of data. They say, where are we going to share the data? Once we decide that some of this data will be open, where are we going to share? And here they say, well, we have different platforms, and one of them at the bottom is Zenodo, this open repository. And then they say, well, which level of accessibility will be public? There will be any kind of registered, and which will be the type of availability and the required software tool. For instance, here they say, well, you need an Excel, or you need SPSS, etc. So I think this is a good practice. I can say that it's a best practice if you want to have all that information. And this is a another way of having a data management plan, maybe more systematic, but you see for each data set, which are the different degrees of the process of making a data management plan. Okay, so once we've seen these two examples, let's have a look on how the output management plan looks, the one from La Caixa. You have the platform where there are different information. That's the way I see the platform. This is a project. I don't know if it's from some of you that are today here, but this is the name of the application, so the bureaucratic information about the project. And then we have the output summary, the responsibilities, the FAIR data, the data security, and other matters. So in the first part, the output summary, what you are asked to do is to briefly and concisely describe the data or output that will be generated or collected or reused, the formats and standards that will be used, the value of the output for other researchers, and what data or output cannot be shared and why. Afterwards, we have the section on responsibilities, and that's important to know who is in charge of monitoring the plan. So you're gonna see that you are following the plan or you are making changes. Managing the data, and this could be more than one. I mean, you can say each group will manage the data and afterwards will be, let's say, like a general management or whatever. Preservation and conservation, and important also to specify who will decide about the access to the data in case it is not completely open, or meanwhile, before you publish any data. And if there is any intellectual property right, who will own the rights? Could be your institution, could be together in a consortium, etc. Then we enter to the FAIR part, the findable data. And as I said, this is more focused on once you're going to share the data, how you're going to achieve this fairness with your data. So which kind of metadata will you use? If there is a specific metadata, specific ontologies in your field, you can put here, we follow this ontology, we follow this schema. But if not, you can say, and I've read it, we want to follow the data site schema or the Dublin core schema because we'll publish in this repository or the other one. That's fair enough. Which identifier? Probably in many cases here, you'll say, we will place the data in this repository and we'll have a DOI. That's a solution. And if you are using version control, so just mention, we're going to use this method to have this version control, and every change, every periodically time, we'll have different versions of our data. When we are asking you about accessibility, is the idea of who can access the data and when. And as I said, you can make different situations depending on the actual data. So if you're still working with the data, so you will grant access to a small group of people. Specify the availability of the data. If there will be any method of software that are needed to access or to work with the data. If it's possible to add documentation about the software, and where will be the software, the data, the metadata, any output deposit. And finally, specifying here, could be specified here, could be specified also in the reused part, who and how will grant the access, if it's possible, even when we have restrictions. The interoperability is more or less the idea of, well, we try to use control vocabularies, we want to use variables that are commonly used among our colleagues. So I don't know, if you define in a way some specific sample, some specimen, some genes, whatever, and you already, with your community, you already use the same language. So you don't invent new languages, because it will be harder to understand your data if you use something that you build from scratch. Of course, if it doesn't exist, It's completely normal and understandable that you make new vocabularies. But if there is already something already established and consolidated, go for it. And finally, the reusability is which degree of reusability will be permitted when the data is made available to other research and wider public, when the data will be accessible for reuse, and if there is an embargo, if there is a period of time that data will not be accessible, so explain which will be that embargo, for which period of time, etc. If data will be restricted, why data will be restricted. So for instance, what we've seen in that table, and if you expect to have the data available for a period of time. So let's say, for instance, something that is quite common in many repositories, they say that they commit to have your data for at least 10 years. So you can also specify that this data will be reusable for these 10 years. Finally, we have also some information about data security. So how you're going to keep your data. In many cases, you already have facilities in your institution, in your labs, that you have already a policy on data backups. So just mentioning, it's something that it's more information for you, and to make yourself your question and say, I'm not sure. I'm going to ask the technical team about if I place the data here, how we will have a backup. What will happen if there is an attack or there is a loss of information? How can I recover the information? So it's something that it's important to have it in the data management plan, because you already have thought about this issue, and it would be easier to have the solution if you have already think about that. And of course, if needed, because sometimes it's not needed, but I think in your case, in your research, it's almost every of you have to pass an ethical review. So you can just say, well, we have these ethical issues, we have already passed the review, or we have still pending a validation from the ethical committee because we have this, and this other issue. It's not that here you have to describe all the ethical review, because you already have done that in other venues, in other committees. So here is more like you think about if there is any ethical issue. But as I say, in your case, I am quite positive that it will happen in many cases. So this is what is asked, and now I want to just review some of the things that I've seen, just to mention and maybe to improve. As I said, probably some of the things that I'm gonna to refer now are from previous output management plans. I've seen some of the last ones. Probably some of you have already used the platform and have already sent the projects, and I must say I'm quite happy to see that the output management plans have improved, and there is more detailed information. And there are things that here I want to mention that are already solved in these new plans. So as I said at the beginning, I think we are in a good way. We are all learning on how to use the output management plans. So I must say I'm quite happy. But however, I want to state some of the common errors I've seen, as I said, in former data management plans, when they say, for instance, this idea of processed data will be publicly available in scientific articles. I think we need to get rid of this idea that data is available if you embed, if you put it in the article. I know that in the article there is data there, but the idea is to have the data outside the article. We have enough tools to link articles and data, and now, even as we've seen before, many journals are asking you, where is your data? Provide me with a DOI, provide me with a handle, another identifier, provide me with this permanent link where I can find the data. So is this idea, you please don't put these things on, I will be already fair because I will publish the data in the scientific data. when they say sometimes open access journals will be a preferred option to publish data, again, I mean, it's not a journal is not the best place to put your data. However, I must say there are already data journals, so journals just dedicated to data. And that's, of course, another solution to publish your data, because that's another thing. It's journals that have this purpose, so it makes sense. But here, what I found in many cases is this mention of open access journal. Open access journal could be any journal and is not where you need to place your data. And that's the third one. It's like a good example where they say, well, results will be published in international peer review open access journals. Fine enough. And data sets will be made available in public repositories. So it's this idea. And both they will be linked. And there are tools, as I said, and even projects. There is one called Scholix, or even the Elsevier is now providing with a monitor called Mendeley Data Monitor, where you can find the data related to publications, etc. So there are already tools. If you publish with a rich metadata, with rich information, your data in any of those public repositories, and there are several options you can have, then the data will be completely linked. And for instance, the database we use, there is one metadata that say related publications. So all that information is also linked together. Other things, I've seen in many cases that there is still a lot of uses of PDF. I already mentioned that I'm not an enthusiastic of PDF, even I use it a lot. I'm not an enthusiastic sometimes when you talk about data. PDF is fantastic for documentation, but probably is not the best solution in many cases. I just put here a couple of sentences from different data. So if you have a choice between, for instance, an Excel or a PDF, if you are aimed at facilitating the reusability, of course, an Excel format will be better than a PDF, because with Excel, I could reuse the data easily than the PDF. I know that sometimes PDF can be transformed to Excel or other formats. But if you have the original format and it's not the PDF, it's better to share the data in the original format. And of course, there are concerns, and with Aitana, we already discussed that. But don't do. Sometimes I remember even in my own university that they had some original format that was more reusable, and they were publishing in PDF, and then people were asking for that data, and they were going back, so transforming the PDF to the original format. Doesn't make sense. Publish with the original format. And if you need to publish in PDF, it's something that you can put as an addition, not as the only format to share. Again, I want to also acknowledge something that it's really a good practice. So here, for instance, they explain from another output management plan, all data will be stored in digital form, either in original format, and they explain which are some of these original formats, and then for after other formats. So here there's an explanation of all different formats that are specific. Of course, for instance, if you have images, probably TIFF is the preference if you want to especially preserve the image, but also you have to find the balance, because sometimes TIFF images, they require a lot of space. But of course, if you're using a JPEG, then there is some loss of information. But maybe you can agree that the information lost is not so important, so you can keep that. But it's, as a preference, in many cases, they will tell you, keep the TIFF and publish the JPG or publish the PNG, etc. So that's some of this compromise that you have to balance with preservation and with sharing. Sharing a file with PNG or JPG, it's enough, and it's fair enough to be reused. But if you want to preserve, in many cases, in many facilities will tell you, keep the original files, raw files, TIFF files, etc., because we can commit to preserve better your information. And then there is these ideas of the FAIR principles. I've seen in many output management plans in the past, I must say, that there are a lot of information about data, and there are a mix about the FAIR principles. And I was a bit concerned at the beginning. So I think now with the platform, there is a clear explanation on what you need to provide with that information. Here, there is a bit of mixing. Of course, here they explain at the beginning that during the development of the project, the data will be closed. That makes a lot of sense. And when I publish the results, will be presented in peer review articles and specialized or institutional repository. But there is more an explanation here. What are you going to do with the publication than with the data? Okay. And they say at the minimum, all the data requested to be publicly available by the publishing journal. It's not that the publishing journal, of course, publishing journals are requesting you to make some data available. But in this case, it's also the funder. I mean, in this case, La Caixa is not just asking you for the output management plan, it's asking you to make as much data as possible open. So it's not, you don't need to think about what the publisher is asking you. It's also, you need to think for you, which is the data that you want to share. And I hope that you want to share some data. And also that the funder is asking you, please share more data. So you also have to take into account that what you are asked is to share data when you publish, not just because of the publisher, it's also because of the funder. They say the institutions are free to decide how they handle any remaining data and how they post it for public access. So I understand that here there are more information, more data that, well, it's not crucial with the publication, and it makes, of course, a lot of sense. And here also there is a mention of application of a license. Probably in a data management plan, it will be useful that you already have thought a bit on which kind of license are you going to use. To think a bit about, well, I'm going to use this license that is completely open. I'm going to have some restrictions. And the importance of the restrictions is that you may expect that someone will want to lift those restrictions. So meaning that if you say, I don't want to allow derivative works, I don't want to allow commercial uses, maybe someone will knock at your door and say, I want to make a derivative work, I want to make a commercial use, I want to do things that the license does not grant me. So if you, in your data management plan, and specifically in your team, you have to get ready to get an answer, and you have to know who is going to give the answer. And then, of course, you have to think about in which conditions you will grant that permission and in which conditions you will not grant that permission. Of course, you cannot decide at the beginning which were could be the people or the organizations that will ask for that, but at least to have a way to answer. Don't do that let's keep saying, no, I cannot answer because I don't know who the data belongs to, or we haven't decided who is going to grant that, and don't do that at the end of the project. So it's something that you have to do at the beginning and put it in this data management plan. More about FAIR principles. Here they say all the data generated will become available in the public domain. Be careful, because public domain is a term that legally has consequences. So public domain means there is no copyright at all. So if you say that it's in the public domain, means that you may use, for instance, CC0. It's sometimes dangerous when you want to say that all data will become publicly available. It's something, so meaning that the public will access to that data, but don't use the term public domain because it has some consequences. They say that, well, it will be once the publication is accepted or published. To ensure reproducibility and validation of our results by other scientists, documentation of original data will be available for inspection. So it means that this data is going to be closed, or it was the same in the same output management plan. It was not clear which data will be available in the public domain, as it was said, or if it's available in the public domain, then why we need to. So probably what they wanted to say, and it was not clear, that the raw data will be closed and only will be available for request. So make it clear which data is in which condition and which data is not conditional. And again, this idea of final data will be submitted for publication as required by most reputable scientific journals. Well, and linking with Joanna's questions before, sometimes you don't really need a submission for publishing data, because in the repositories you are free to publish. It's like a preprint server where you can just put your data. So it's not just a submission, sometimes that you publish the data. And as I said before, maybe we'll have also this idea of reviewing data and improving the quality of the data. And I fully agree that probably as a reviewer, sometimes if you have access to the data together with the publication, you might say to the researchers, improve your data. I just remember one of paper that I published a few years ago that we also published some data. In fact, the reviewer or even the editor asked us to improve some of the data, and we improved the data. So before publishing the final version of the data, we made some improvements. So it was even the reviewer of the paper, or in this case also the editor, that asked us to improve, especially because of the decimals or some value that was not clear. We decided to do that. So it's this idea of having the data published somewhere, and once you submit the paper and the result in a global way, then reviewers can also review your data. I like this in line with the European recommendations on general open science policies. Once our group feels that all the scientific potential of the data can be studied in our laboratory has been exploited, we may study making data openly accessible in the future. So with this, even they are aligned with the recommendations and the general open science policy, they are not sure if the data will be accessible in the future, because they will study. Well, I think here we need to be more concrete and to say that we will study that a part of the data, or we will commit to publish some part of the data, because it's not clear here if they, I mean, it's always nice to see that you know about the recommendations and the policies, and even some of you mentioned some policy of your institution and that you support it and everything. But at the end, sometimes you are not acting accordingly. So it's more like something that you just say, it seems nice to say that, but we are not going to share anything. And again, something that really was shocking a bit is like the last one, say the data requested to be publicly available. Again, it's something that is iterative, something that it seems that only publishers are requiring data. So the data requested to be publicly available by the publishing journal will be made publicly available, perfect, and therefore accessible by the article DOI. No, I mean, again, we want DOI for data, a different one. I mean, if it's provided by the same company, probably you will have the same initial number of the DOI, the initial prefix, because the prefix is fixed for a supply of DOIs. But it's not that your data needs to be identified by the article DOI. Your data needs an individual DOI. And many of the repositories that we mentioned before provide you with DOIs. So you will have a DOI different, and then it's when you will link DOIs of data with DOIs of articles and multiple articles, because the same DOI could be used in different articles if you are using this data set for different activities of your research. So that's more or less what I wanted to share with you. I think we still have around a bit less than 10 minutes. If I will just stop sharing my presentation. I left here my contact, especially my email address, because we want also to provide you with some more individualized advice or consult if you are interested in your specific requirements, in your specific research, you need some clarification, you can contact us, and then we will schedule some meeting and we can discuss on how to improve your output management plan, or also if you have any question on your research activities related with the data, we can discuss it further. So I'm stopping the presentation and I'll come back to you. Seeing again some faces, and please, I don't see anything in the chat, but I've seen some hand already raised, and I see Rodrigo Freire. So hello, Rodrigo. You want to switch on the camera if you can?
Hello.
If not, we'll hear you. Hello.
Yes, sure. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for a very clear and encompassing presentation. I learned a lot. My question is related to the following. There are different types of licenses that we can use to license our data once we release them. And as I understood it correctly, we can release the data in multiple, and we should release the data in multiple formats so that it makes it easier for people with different needs to actually use this data. For example, if one wants to do like a quick inspection, a human readable format would be much better, but if you want to do some extra analysis, a format that would allow for machine learning to actually read the data would be preferable. My question is there a summarized table or some source of information that we could use in order to better select the type of license that we should use for each one of these conditions, so that to allow for reusability? We would allow us to have control, to have better information. You understand what I'm saying? For example, we might want to share if we do electrophysiology, we are probably less likely to share hours and hours and hours of a highly temporal sampling rate acquisition data, which would take like gigabytes and gigabytes, because that would be useful for a very small fraction of people. So, but we can share the spike times once the data has been sorted already. And we can share both of them under different types of licenses. Where is the summary table that we could actually use to make that decision?
Well, thank you for the question. If you are, for instance, selecting some of the Creative Commons license, there is an information there in the web page. However, I can provide you, because the other day I was doing some kind of report and I have a table on the differences. I need to repeat again that sometimes it's more the license effects of the extraction of the information, because sometimes the information itself is not protected by copyright. So the license, Creative Commons license have 6 licenses. 3 of them prohibits by default the non-commercial, the commercial uses. So the other 3 allows commercial uses. So meaning that if you are sharing openly, anyone can use it commercially or not, depending on the license. Another important element of the license is the derivative works. And when we're talking about databases or data, a derivative work is a new data set, a new database that is used to make another database. So if I use all the contents of your database and I build another database, this is a derivative work. And the license, some of them allow that by default. Others impose what we call the called copyleft condition, meaning that if I share openly my database with this copyleft condition, if you use the contents to make a new database, then you need also to provide this new database with the same condition. So meaning that other people can build upon your database. And finally, there are a couple of licenses that prohibits these derivative works by default. So meaning that unless you grant authorization, no one can build a new database based on your original database. So this is in summary, which are the 6 different licenses. We put together also the combination of commercial with derivative works, but any of the license, any of the 6 licenses will allow to anyone to reuse your database in a non-commercial way, because 3 of them will also go a bit farther, but the only restriction is this non-commercial. People could copy, could distribute, or they can also publish your database, but always acknowledging the authorship of that database. The 6 license got this BY, the by condition, that is the attribution condition. So if you stack a Creative Commons license in your database, then people need to mention. There is another option that is the CC0. This is also called the public dedication tool, that it's a bit more like I'm getting rid of everything. And here is more like the recognition, this acknowledgement of authorship is more based on community norms than in the legal issues. So it's not, if we all know, we are now more than 40 people, if we were all working in the same database and we could be understood as authors of that database, with CC0, there is no need to mention all of our names. CC0 is more meant to say, this is the database done by Health Research Grantees Caixa. And with that, you fulfill the norm of the community, and CC0 is aimed at this goal. There are other license. There is this Open Data Commons that provides 3 more licenses that are similar, because one is with the copyleft effect, the other one is like a public domain, a CC0, saying everything without any commitment for even acknowledge the authorship. And the other one is a CC BY, so a license that will allow you anything, but you are committed to mention all the names of the people there. And that's the idea in summary. But if not, Rodrigo, you can send me an email. I can send you this information in the document.
Thank you.
Dolores, I don't know if you want to switch on the camera and make your question that is in the chat.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It is only about that paragraph of version control that appeared in the output plan from La Caixa. What does it mean?
Well, I could say this is if applicable. I mean, it's not mandatory for all of you. It's like the idea that if you are using, you plan to have data sets that it's going to be the same data set, but with updated information. Usually what is a good recommendation is to have a strategy of version control. So how are you going to control the different versions? How are you going to identify that version 1, version 2, version 3? How do you expect these versions to be periodically updated? So that's the idea of the version control. But if you are just working with data sets that are going to be separated, they're going to be changing during time, this, I could say, does not apply to you.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. So if I'm correct, I don't see any raised hand, and Joanna is raising physically. Joanna Costa, please. We cannot hear you. I think you are muted. You are muted, please. Now? I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. I don't know what's... I don't know if it's any technical problem.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now.
Oh, sorry, it was me probably because I had the headphones. I'm sorry. I'd just like to ask, it's not a question, it's your opinion in a bit of a more macro landscape thing, which is, I'm giving you an example. For example, in Portugal, our national funding agency, so they have set some open access and open science policies and so on. They have the activities. And so they set up a national repository, which they manage a bit as a tool, let's say, as an activity within this bigger policy that they are following. And my question is, in terms of the globability of science and sharing resources, does it make sense to have many different entities creating their own tools and repositories, or should it be something more organized in an integrated way? For example, it could be like, for example, a regional, like the example that you gave in the beginning that you developed, integrating different universities and research centers, something really just national and then integrated, for example, in an European dimension. What is your opinion? It's just that for me, I don't see that it makes much sense. Many different entities creating their own repositories without having an integration, at least at the national level.
I fully agree, and I'm working on that. I mean, we even in Spain we are thinking on how to integrate these different data repositories. I can share with you my experience. Sometimes you already have some international solutions that have been there for many years, and that's why I was saying to you that that's the first option. I mean, even don't go to your national repository, go to your international repository, because it's the way. For me, for instance, from my institution point of view, what I would like to gather is to know where are you publishing your data. So in the same way, I'm asking you.
Yes. So a local support, I think that's essential.
Yes. So the same way that I'm asking my researchers, where are you publishing? I may say, where are you publishing your data? And I don't want your data to be in my repository. I want to know maybe in my CRIS system. So if you publish in scientific reports, if you publish in Nature, if you publish in the journal of whatever, I want to know that. So I want to know where is the data. And maybe I would need like a kind of catalog of research data. If what I did is to build a part of my research, of my repository to get ready for data, because I had at that time no a national repository, no a regional repository, and people was asking me for a solution. Once we have now this Catalan repository, what we have done is to send the data there by keeping the identifiers, because the identifiers have already been used, so they are already in scientific papers. So we want these identifiers being alive, so being solved. But we are building, because we prefer to work together in a national, let's call it national solution, that it will be easier to be connected to this promised open science cloud than to try to figure out how to connect, multiple solutions that we could build in our own places. So sometimes it's more like you need to provide with solutions that don't exist at the moment, but maybe you have to get ready to mutate and to adapt your solutions to future solutions in the next years. So I agree that probably this idea of having more national or consortiate solutions are better than to have small individual solutions. But at the end, what is good is that it all use the same standardization of metadata, of information. We can build this idea of this top layer harvester, and then you as a researcher, you only have to think, I'm gonna go to this or the other solution that I know that are collected in these topical. And when you try to find data, you can go to this top layer and go for it. And it doesn't matter if it's in Portugal, if it's in Barcelona, if it's wherever, because the data is there. And also they can provide you with multiple data sets with the same query from multiple sources. And that's the idea. So I fully agree with that.
Thank you.
We are out of time, but if any of you have to leave, please, no problem. I have some question. Lisette asks, when should we fill the DMP? Will it be available at the submission portal? Yes, it is available there in the submission portal. I don't know if Lisette, you want to open your mic?
Yeah, hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, I failed to find this in the submission portal, but this is actually what I asked.
Well, I think once you get the project approved, then you'll have you will be asked to fill. But I don't know if any of the colleagues from La Caixa will maybe answer you better than me in this case. I think Carla Carbonell is.
Yes.
Please, Carla, go ahead.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah.
Yes. So right now we're finishing all the process for signing the grant agreements. When all that is set and you have the kickoffs with your project managers from La Caixa, then we'll give you access to all the post-award section.
Okay.
There will be 2 new tabs on your application, just next to the tabs you filled into the application. And then you'll find there the output management plan to fill in. So probably in a couple of weeks, you'll have available that in the system.
Thank you. I just wanted to be sure that I understand the whole thing. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carla, for the explanation. And well, I think we've been together for a bit more than 2 hours. I think that's enough for the moment. I hope that this session has been useful for you, and not just for filling the output management plan, but for your research and to have a thought about how we are dealing with the data, how we are doing this management of the research data. And as I said, I'm open to continue the discussions, to comment on your specific case or resolve some of your questions. So I hope to see you soon in another place virtually, and hopefully one day personally. Bye-bye, and see you next time.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.